July 16th, 1829, a medicine man and chief was born. His name, Geronimo. He was part of the Chiricahua Apache tribe and would become known for fighting the Mexicans to the south, the U.S. government to the north, and neighboring Comanche and Navajo tribes. Years later, in 1851, Geronimo would return to camp only to find his wife, 3 children, and mother killed by Mexican soldiers. In anger and grief, Geronimo would devote his life and time to hunting down the killers and seeking revenge. In 1872, the U.S. government established a reservation for Chiricahua Apaches, but in defiance and rebellion, Geronimo would escape confinement time and time again. 13 years later, the chief would lead 135 Apache people to permanently flee the reservation, where they would travel over 65 miles per day. On this journey, Apache freedom fighters would raid Mexican and American settlements, sometimes wiping out everyone and everything in sight. On March of 1886, Geronimo was forced to surrender to General George Crook, but escaped captivity yet again. Geronimo and 40 followers were on the run for 5 months, but surrendered shortly after. This time, after surrendering, Chief Geronimo was sent across the country, but his final destination was in Fort Still, Oklahoma. During this time in Fort Still, Geronimo would sign autographs, take photos, and occasionally make traditional items for a booming tourism industry who was fascinated with the famous outlaw. Some of the items Geronimo autographed were finely made bows, arrows, and quivers. While the vast majority of these bows were crafted by other tribal cultures, on rare occasion Geronimo crafted his own items. Unfortunately, most of the bows, arrows, and quivers were sold on the private market with poor documentation, leaving very little context. One of Geronimo's final items signed and made was a simple bow and arrow set. When examining the bow, the belly side is marked and signed Geronimo 1901 to Thos P. Martin. The tag on the attached bow goes on to say Thomas Martin presented this to the Oklahoma Historical Society in 1933. The original tag also identifies the bow as being made by Geronimo as a gift to Mr. Martin. In 1909, Chief Geronimo would die in Fort Still, Oklahoma due to complications of pneumonia. In this video, I want to take you step by step in reproducing and recreating one of Geronimo's final bows he made before his passing that was gifted to Thomas P. Martin. Now, due to the poor documentation of Geronimo's items that he made, gifted, and signed, it really is difficult to discern what materials he used or didn't use. It is indeed an educated guess. Now, in reference to the bow that he gifted to Thomas P. Martin, I've narrowed it down to 2 different wood species that it can possibly be. The first one is Osage orange. The grain looks an awful lot like Osage, but the thing that throws me off is the color and the seasoning of the bow. Osage, after time, it starts to turn a darker brown color from its pale yellow color, or even amber color. But on the other hand, the wood looks, the seasoning at least, looks a lot like ash. The color looks very, very close to seasoned ash, so it could either be Osage or ash. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'll be using a very nice piece of Osage orange. This is the log that I'll be using. You can see it has beautiful grain from tip to tip. It's a shorter stave, shorter bow, just like Geronimo's final gifted bow. Now, I want to take this to the workshop, and we're going to start establishing the back of this stave. All right, so I am now inside of the workshop, and it is time to dive headfirst into this project. The first thing that we do, of course, when working with natural wood and building a bow, is to season the stave. The second thing is, when the bow stave is seasoned, to chase a single growth ring from tip to tip. This back is under tremendous tension as we pull the string back and cast the arrow and even tiller the bow, whether it's a floor tiller or a final tiller in this project. So as you can see, we have the cross section of this stave, and you can see there's different colored growth rings on this cross section. We have a more pale yellow color, that is the early wood, and a darker amber color, that is the late wood. I need to establish a single late wood ring from tip to tip. That becomes the back of the bow that's under tremendous tension as we draw that string back. So from the tip here, you can see there's very shallow amber colored growth rings. I want to avoid those. And then the third ring down, there's a nice wide ring, and I have that penciled in. That is the ring that I'm after. And I'll chase that once again from tip to tip. That establishes the back of the bow. And here's the knot. You can see I have a small island around it, so I can go back at a later time and pick away this late and some of the early wood off of the surface. So as we look at this stave, I follow a ring. By the time I'm done with working all of these knots on the stave, this single growth ring will rise and fall with the contours of the knot. Okay, so you can see I have the measurements drawn on the back of this bow. This is really easy. As long as you have a ruler, no problem whatsoever. Unlike the Hoopa and Modoc bow, this is pretty self-explanatory. So what I do is I find the total length of the stave. In this case, it's a short stave, short bow, 48 inches, and I divide that by 2. So then I make a horizontal mark. That becomes the center of the bow and the center of the handle. On each side from that center mark, I find 2 inches on each side, both left and right side, and I make 2 more horizontal marks. That is my handle area. From there, I find the center point of the center of the handle, and I just trace a line vertically. That becomes the center of this bow. And it's really important when you find that center and you're etching out that center line, you want to follow the grain. If there's dips and turns and it's kind of wonky and snaky, you want to follow that bend. That's really, really important. If the grain wanders off, that creates a weak spot and the bow will likely break. In this case, I have a nice straight grain pattern, beautiful grain pattern, so I just trace it right down from tip to tip. From there, I find off the center mark or the center line, the center vertical line, 1.25 inches, and I follow that out all the way up. So I run 1.25 inches every 2 inches, and you can see every 2 inches, just for reference, I have horizontal marks. I connect those lines together, and in this case, I have a bow that's 1.25 inches wide. So now on to the tips. The tips, I find 6 inches, and I create a horizontal mark. You can see here, I have 2 horizontal marks, 6 inches from each tip. Then I find 1/4 inch on each side from that vertical line, and I make another mark. I lay the ruler flat and I taper the tips. So my tips will taper at 6 inches. So that's all that's to it. Really not a whole lot of work with this design and layout. So at this point, we'll take this stave back into the workshop, use my draw knife to follow these lines, and then I'll flip the stave over and start removing large chunks of mass on this belly side. I want to get this bow down to a floor tiller where both limbs are starting to bend evenly. So we have our work cut out for us. Well, I've been working on this stave for a couple hours, and you can see it's now starting to look like a bow. I followed those lines, and most important, removed a lot of belly mass with that draw knife. At this point, I really need to slow down. I have to slow down this process. If I continue to use that draw knife, I risk gouging this wood, creating a hinge that I might not be able to work out during the final tiller. So I'm going to transition into a rasp. This is a Shinto rasp. It's really an excellent tool that any woodworker, whether you're making a bow, an outlaw and dart, or furniture, should have. It slows down the process and removes even amounts of mass. So on this you have a series of hacksaw blades on both sides, an aggressive side and then a more finer detailed side. So once again, we will continue this floor tiller, remove belly mass, get these limbs to start bending. Nothing harvested from the landscape is perfectly shaped or straight. While this bow is easy to work with, heat corrections must be made. When the bow becomes thin, the wood is placed into a steamer and the side bend is removed from its profile. Dry heat is then applied to set the heat corrections into place. Well, this bow is just about ready for the final tiller. Everything's looking really good with the floor tiller. Both limbs seem to be bending nice and even. But as I took this bow off of the steamer and made my heat corrections, I noticed longitudinal cracks, very shallow longitudinal cracks appeared in both limbs. And that really does not affect the integrity of the bow whatsoever. It's very, very common with Osage orange. As a matter of fact, my personal Osage bow is sinew-backed, and it has cracks all over the sides, all over the belly, throughout the handle, and that's 13 years old. I still hunt with that bow. It's an excellent bow. So once again, it does not affect the integrity and the performance of the bow whatsoever, but cosmetically, it doesn't really look too good. So what I've decided to do is back this bow with a strip of rawhide. That'll clean this back up. Now, it's really important to note that Geronimo's final bow that he gifted, it did not have any backing whatsoever. Didn't have sinew, didn't have rawhide, and certainly not snakeskin. So that is one altercation that I'm going to be making to the back of this bow, but everything else will remain consistent. The shape, the design, the profile, the layout, and certainly the tiller. So with that said, I am going to proceed forward and adding a thin strip of rawhide to the back of this bow. Unlike sinew, the application of rawhide does not add power to the bow. The advantage to rawhide gives a bow more stability while offering a shorter dry time. In its raw form, the hide is trimmed and submerged into water for 24 hours. After the hide becomes softened, a heavy application of glue is brushed onto its surface. The hide is then pressed onto the bow and wrapped tightly with a medical bandage wrap and rope. After 3 days, the wraps are removed and the sides are filed to rid of any excess of hide in unwanted areas. This rawhide appears to have done its job. Everything looks really good. I don't see any lifting within the seams, so hopefully that keeps up. And you can now see I have this bow just at about full brace height. So we are ready to enter into the final tillering process. Now, looking at the bow, it really doesn't look too bad. The floor tiller is quite appealing. The only couple things that I'm noticing right off the bat is right in this fade on the bottom limb. This is bending a bit more, whereas from the mid limb to the tip, this remains a bit flat. Quite the opposite is occurring on this upper limb. This area right in here, so from the tip to just above that mid limb, is bending more. This area is kind of flat, especially right in through here. I have a little bit of bend going on right here, but this area I can see has a flat spot. But not bad, and that's looking good. It's starting to flex too. So we will enter into the final tillering process of this bow. Geronimo's last bow he gifted before his passing appears to have a whip tiller. Simply put, a whip tiller carries most of the bend from the mid-limb through the tip. When the bow was sold in 2016, it was still strung. By keeping a bow strung for long periods of time, the tiller will change throughout its years, thus making it very difficult to determine its true bending profile. After 4 days of wood removal, the limbs bend perfectly even. To complete this project, the handle is wrapped in a thin strip of smoked brain tan leather. The final product is a very close reproduction of Geronimo's final bow before his passing. This bow is now complete, and I gotta tell you, as I tiller any bow, I never check the weight on and off the tree. The most important factor for me in making a bow is making sure that the limbs are bending nice and even. And in this case, beautiful tiller. So I want to check the weight. I've been doing this a long time. I think it weighs about 50 pounds is what I feel on and off the tree. But this pulley scale will give me accurate results. Hopefully we have 50 pounds. That would be a great hunting weight in this area for deer and elk. So I just hooked this up to the string. We'll pull it back. I have it set at 0. And as I pull it back, this scale will go up to my true weight. I'm pulling it at 20 inches of total draw. As I shoot this bow in, I'll easily hit 21 inches. On the tree, I did hit 21 a few times. So let's see where we're at. Once again, centered at 0. There's 20 inches. 55 pounds. That is a great weight for this bow. That's exactly what I was hoping for. So I exceeded my goal of 50 pounds. Let's weigh it one more time just to make sure. So that time, 54 pounds. So I have a 54 to 55 pound bow. Once I hit 21 inches of draw, I'll gain 2 pounds, and that will be even better. So very pleased with the results. Let's take this down to the archery range and start shooting. It's been 115 years since the passing of Chief Geronimo. While myths, stories, and legends still surface to this day, oral traditions describe his perseverance against enemy forces as being supernatural. And while Geronimo does not have a voice in modernity, his descendants share the same warrior spirit as he once did.